The third chapter, An Ocean. When Jane woke up in the morning, bright yellow sunlight was streaming across the bed, and the strangest noise was coming in the window. Clickety, clickety, click. Over and over again, exactly like somebody running a stick back and forth across a picket fence. But Jane couldn't remember seeing any picket fences yesterday, or any people that looked as if they might run a stick across one either. She sat up and looked out the window. Right outside, there was a tall, curved coconut palm. One enormous frond hung down across the window, and little gusts of wind were running down its stiff green fingers. Clickety-click, clickety, clickety-click, and the top of a thick bush was crowding up against the screen, simply covered with big pink flowers, all blooming away as if it was no trouble at all. Jane jumped out of bed and pawed through the suitcase on the floor until she found shorts, an old shirt, and a pair of sneakers. When she was dressed, she opened the apartment door a cautious crack and peeked out. Way down at the end of the long hall, she could see sunlight through the front screen door, the door Victoria had tried to escape through. And there was another open door at this end of the hall, the back door, it must be, because through the screen, she could see trash cans and clotheslines in a sort of shed. And in between were all those other doors. All shut now, thank goodness. Quickly, she stepped across the hall to number 5 and slipped in. Mother was all dressed to go out. I have an appointment with Mr. Merrill at 9, she explained. Keep an eye on Betsy and don't let her bother anybody. I'll get some real groceries on my way back. Don was eating 2 bananas at once, one in each hand. Have a banana, he said, with his mouth full. Unless you'd rather have sardines or canned beans, that's all there is. One good thing about nothing but bananas for breakfast is no dishes to wash. Jane tossed the empty peels into the garbage container and fed Victoria sardines right out of the can. Not that she deserves any, after the awful way she acted yesterday, said Jane. Goodness, wouldn't it be embarrassing if that Mr. Brundage were to walk in and catch us feeding his sardines to our cat? He might, said Don. He sure expected to come back when he left. How would you know? He left some of his stuff here, a suit and a raincoat and some shirts and socks. Donald Sanders, does Mother know you've been prying around in somebody else's belongings? Demanded Jane. For Pete's sakes, we're going to unpack and stay here a while, aren't we? And how are we going to do that if we don't open the closets and bureau drawers? Just tell me that, exclaimed John. Victoria wants out, said Betsy. Oh, dear, I'll have to go out with her and make sure she doesn't run away again, said Jane. Of course, she's had a couple meals here now, so maybe she's beginning to feel at home. Jane shooed Betsy out the back door and held the screen door open for Victoria. Victoria did indeed feel at home. She paused on the doorsill just the way she always did at home, neither out nor in, and refused to budge until Jane gave her a good shove. Then she walked haughtily around the trash cans and disappeared under a bush, the same pink-flowered bush Jane had noticed through her window. It was one of a row that stretched clear around the building, each one full to bursting with different colored flowers, pink and white, orange and red, salmon and yellow. Ooh, pretty, cried Betsy, reaching out a hand. Don't touch, said Jane sharply. Then she thought, for goodness sakes, why not? Go ahead, honey, pick a couple, she said. I forgot. They're our own flowers. Betsy ran from bush to bush, overwhelmed by so large a choice. At last she picked a red one and a pink one, and Jane tucked them into the barrette that held her curls back. I can't see them, complained Betsy. But everybody else can, said Jane. You look perfectly lovely. 2 of the tenants were sitting in the lawn chairs under the big tree, watching Jane and Betsy. When Jane glanced up at them, they put their heads close together and began talking. About us, I suppose, thought Jane. Don't they have anything else better to do? Come on, Bets, she whispered. Let's go around on the other side of the building and see what it's like there. On that side, there was no lawn, just a thicket, almost a jungle of unpruned bushes, overgrown with vines that wound up the palm trees. It reminded Jane of a movie she had seen at school when they were studying Brazil. Up the Amazon in Technicolor, she thought, and me right in the middle of it. Miss Giddings came around the corner, carrying a watering can. Betsy ran up to her, shouting, See my roses? I look perfectly lovely. Mrs. Giddings nodded vaguely. Not Rosa's child, she murmured. Hibiscuses. Biscuits? Repeated Betsy in amazement. Miss Giddings carried the watering can over to a cement bird bath, half hidden in trailing vines, and began to fill it. I always do this every morning, she explained earnestly. I can't tell you how much the birdies appreciate it. Too many people neglect to put out fresh water for our little feathered friends, she went on, looking straight at Jane, as though Jane were one of these neglectful people. Just because the ocean is so near, they seem to feel there's enough, but of course, the ocean is no good, being salt. Which way is the ocean? Asked Jane. Miss Giddings gestured with one hand. How far away is it? Asked Jane. Miss Giddings didn't answer. She pulled a little box from a pocket and began scattering raisins on the ground, making little soft clucking noises and peering up at the treetops. A mockingbird appeared on a vine leaf. Jane and Betsy stood perfectly still as the mocker fluttered to the ground and began pecking up raisins at Miss Giddings' feet. Something made Jane turn her head. Victoria was creeping silently from under a bush, belly flat, only the tip of her tail twitching ever so slightly. Scat! Hissed Jane. The bird flashed up onto a palm frond. Victoria shot up the curved trunk after it. Halfway up, she paused. A spray of vine leaves draped coquettishly around her neck, and her claws slipping in the smooth bark. Then she slithered backwards down to the ground and walked sedately off. Oh, I'm dreadfully sorry, cried Jane. I'll shut Victoria up inside if you'd like, she offered. Miss Giddings did not even glance at her. That dreadful, murdering cat, she exclaimed shrilly. Well, then, the bird shan't come here any more. She put the box of raisins down and marched over to the bird bath and began tipping the water out of it. Jane watched her struggling with the heavy bird bath and wondered whether she ought to offer to help. Then she noticed Betsy stuffing the last of Miss Giddings' raisins into her mouth, so she quickly took Betsy by the wrist and towed her out to the street in front of the building. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see that there were now 4 cheer-sitters on the lawn. She just looked straight in front of her and led Betsy up to the end of the block. At the corner, she slowed down and let go of Betsy's wrist. We're going to take a nice walk and find an ocean, she announced. What's an ocean? Asked Betsy. An ocean, you'll see, promised Jane. Back on the main street, she turned in the direction of Miss Giddings had pointed, the opposite direction from the railroad station. They soon left the town behind, and the paved street turned into a sandy road, and the sun beat down on their heads. They walked and walked. Are you sure there's an ocean on this street? Asked Betsy finally. Maybe we passed it already. You can't pass an ocean without noticing it, said Jane. Suddenly, the road ran up a little ridge, all covered with tall, coarse grass. At the top, a cool breeze hit them in the face. And there was the ocean. They just stood and looked and looked. Oh, Jane, said Betsy at last with a sigh. It's so big. It was, too. It was blue and sparkling, and it stretched out to the very edge of the sky, and the white beach curved along beside it. On and on to the very edge of the world. 6 little sun-faded cottages were scattered along the sandy ridge above the beach, but they were all boarded up and empty. Jane and Betsy had all the wide water and sand and sky and sun all to themselves. They ran across the hot white beach and took off their shoes at the very edge, where the little waves hissed up and darkened the sand. Jane waded and splashed and shouted, and the enormous empty spaces all around swallowed up the shouts, so they hardly made any noise at all. Betsy cooled her bare feet in the foamy curved ruffles at the edge of the waves, but it was the sand she loved best. At home, sand cost money, and when the sand in her sandbox got spilled out, she had to scrape it up and put it back in, and it was always had a dirty, used look. But here, the whole world was made of glittering sand as far as she could see, as deep as she could dig. She ran up and down the beach screaming and laughing, kicking up great fountains of sand, scattering great handfuls of it, and still there was plenty more everywhere. Finally, she came panting back to Jane. Let's live here forever and ever, she begged. Jane sniffed the exciting smell, from the ocean and wiggled her toes deep into the damp sand, and she knew suddenly that there was nothing in the whole world she would like better than to live here forever and ever. There must be more to Palm Glade than apartments full of fussy old ladies. Somewhere there must be a school, and somewhere houses with children living in them. "Can we, Jane? Can we?" asked Betsy. "I don't know," said Jane soberly. "Mother will have to decide." "Oh, Bets, there's sand in your hair and your ears and even your eyelashes. Stand still while I dust you off." They stayed until the sun was high in the sky and Betsy's nose was bright pink and her sunsuit pockets were bulging with bits of shiny broken shells she had picked out of the sand. Then they put on their shoes and walked back to town. The walk back seemed much shorter, the way it always does. Jane found a shortcut through an alley from the main street that took them right into the backyard and up to the back door without having to walk down Oleander Drive past the chair sitters on the lawn. Mother had been shopping, and there was a fine big lunch waiting for them. "We found an ocean," announced Betsy importantly, and she sat down at the table. "All by ourselves, we found one. And it's not very far away, and it's wonderful. Oh, I wish we could," Jane broke off and asked anxiously. "What does the lawyer think about the place? I mean, whether you ought to keep it or sell it? Did you talk to him about it?" "Yes, I did," replied Mother, "and the way I feel now, I'm about ready to go straight home and let him sell it as soon as he can." "But we just came," objected Don. "Oh, Mother," wailed Jane, "go home away from the ocean and everything? Even if we can't stay and really live here, can't we just stay until school starts?" "I don't really see how," replied Mother. "In the first place, there's a lot to do around a building like this. There's that enormous yard to take care of, and the trash and garbage to dispose of, and the hall to keep clean. And I'm sure fuses are always burning out and little things like that. But maybe Mr. Brundage will be back in a day or so. He's supposed to do all those things, isn't he?" asked Jane hopefully. "Even if he did, I don't see how I could pay him. There are taxes overdue on the place right now, and a huge assessment for paving the front street, which the town is going to do soon. Great Uncle John didn't set aside any money for these things, and apparently he hasn't spent a penny on the place in years. It looks pretty with all the trees and flowers, but the paint is peeling off everywhere, and the carpets are wearing thin, and most of the equipment in the apartments needs repairing or replacing." "But why should we worry about that if the tenants don't?" asked Jane. "The tenants do," replied Mother grimly. "There has been a perfect parade of tenants through here ever since I got back from Mr. Merrill's office, all complaining about leaky ceilings and dripping faucets and a dozen other things. It's a wonder they go on living here if that's the way they feel about it," observed Jane, thinking to herself that it would be a big improvement if they all packed up and left. "The rents are very reasonable, and most of the tenants have lived here a long time, and they're set in their ways," explained Mother. "Goodness knows there are plenty of fancy new places being built, all glass brick corners and picture windows, but somehow I don't think Great Uncle John's tenants would ever feel at home in them." "What I can't understand," Don burst out, "is what he ever did with all his money, if he didn't even repair the roof over his own head." "Mr. Merrill told me that too," said Mother. "It seems he's been scraping together money for years, even including last month's rent money, and setting it aside for a trust fund for something to be called the John W. McGregor Humane Foundation. A sort of super fancy home for stray dogs and cats, as nearly as I could figure out," she laughed. "I'm afraid it will never do any of us any good, but maybe Victoria can spend her declining years there." "I wouldn't have thought he was all that fond of animals," marveled Jane. "Look at the no pets sign out front." "I don't believe he was fond of animals at all, but he had no children or grandchildren, and I suppose he wanted to leave something behind with his name on it." "Doggone, I wish he'd talked it over with me," grumbled Don. "For $1 million, I'd have changed my name to John W. McGregor, and then he could have left it all to me, for less than $1 million even. And I'd have cut you all in on it too," he added generously.